Okay, so welcome to the first lecture for Geography 333. So I'd like to go over just a few administrative things before we get started with the material for today. First, you'll see that there's no quiz this weekend if you go ahead and look at the course schedule. So you can, of course, pause the recording at any time and take a break or go grab a document that you might need. So if you haven't, if you don't have that out already, go ahead and pull up the course schedule, and you'll notice that there's no quiz this weekend, but that starting next weekend, you're going to be having a quiz or a midterm, or in the case of the last week, quiz and a final exam, just about every weekend after this. So during the week, it's going to be a lot of reading, and then at the end of the week, you'll be having a quiz or a midterm on that material. So I've noticed that a number of you have already signed up for your test groups, but I'm going to go ahead and skip down to number 3 here. If you haven't already, please go ahead and sign up for one of those test groups. So test groups A or test groups 1 is Friday. Test groups 2 is Saturday morning, then Saturday evening, then Sunday morning, and Sunday evening is test groups 5. So a lot of you have signed up already. That's great. A lot of you have signed up for Friday, which is also good, also great. It gives you guys the weekend to relax, and remember that the lecture that if you have signed up on Friday, remember the lecture that you're going to be getting will be on Friday at noon. So that gives you about 8 hours to watch the lecture and be prepared for a quiz, which you could have on that topic. So again, trying to spread out the course as much as I can to try to give everyone plenty of time in between to complete the assignments and complete the readings. And it's a very intensive course, so by spreading it out, it's helping to not beat you over the head on any one particular day, give you a little bit of flexibility. So again, this lecture is going to be covering the material that I posted earlier in the week, I think on Monday or Tuesday. And this lecture will be going live on Friday at noon. So remember that in order to earn credit for the reading assignment for this week, students should make sure that you submit that assignment before the lecture on that for the lecture for that topic goes live on noon on either Monday or Wednesday. So this week that is actually this is 12 noon either on Monday or Wednesday. That's not when the lecture of the topic goes live. This should be Wednesday or Friday. This laser pointer is pretty nice. So Wednesday or Friday, the lectures will be going live. Remember that you'll have the reading will be posted on Monday or Wednesday, and the reading for Monday will go live. The lecture for that reading will go live on Wednesday, and the reading that's posted on Wednesday, the lecture for that topic is going to go live on Friday. So, and again, the third point, if you haven't already, please sign up for a test group. You can self-enroll in one of these test groups in course documents. So another question that we should get to before we get into the meat of the material today is, how should you use these lectures, these little video clips that I'm going to be giving you? Well, in other classes, I've given PowerPoints to students. These are the live classes. But again, in those courses, I'm able to vet the quizzes and the final exam and the midterm. I'm able to make sure that students don't use any outside materials for that, including the PowerPoint slides. So because this is an online course with potential multiple choice and short answer questions, I'm not going to be able to be posting these slides that I'm doing that you'll see in these lectures as a PowerPoint format. This is because, if you're even just a little bit tech savvy, you can just directly navigate to the topic of a question by doing, Control F, finding where you need to be. In a lot of cases, you might see the answer to the question right on the slide itself. So not going to be doing an online course in retrieving the answer from PowerPoint slides. So in this particular class, it's going to be important that you actually take your own notes on the material. So I would recommend, if you're playing this, you can either maybe play this and have to the side of the screen have a Word document open, or if you like me and you prefer to have a pen and paper, pull that out. Obviously, you can watch the lecture as many times as you need to take those notes and fast forward and pause and rewind. So you have a lot of advantages over students that do take this class live. So. But you won't have that advantage of having the PowerPoint slides themselves. So I'd recommend that you take your own notes, either on the computer screen, or maybe if you have your iPod or your iPad, you can plug in your headphones, listen to the lecture, and have the slides open and be taking notes all on the computer. So yeah, just make sure that you're taking your own notes, and obviously this means that you can use your own notes on quizzes, midterm, final exam, and I have no way of checking to make sure that you're not using those materials, unlike if this were a live class. So, right, that's that. I won't be able to be posting the PowerPoint slides as the lectures, although they might be helpful. They may be too helpful for the to preserve the sanctity of the course itself. You're going to have to be taking your own notes, and that'll help you memorize and help you to understand and stay current with what we're learning. So, in all my courses, I try to have a lot of quizzes instead of just having all the emphasis be on the final exam or the midterm. And the purpose behind this is to help you stay current with what we're learning, so you don't have to just learn a whole bunch at the end of the course, but instead you'll be able to learn a little bit at a time and keep reviewing that, so that when you come to the final exam, it won't be as big of a deal for you to study for it. You'll have constantly be reminded and seeing examples of the kinds of questions that you'll be seeing. So again, make sure that you're taking your own notes on this material. If there's a slide that you want to see, you can always take a screenshot of that and set it aside, but it's going to be prohibitive for you to take a screenshot of everything, and even then it's fine, because I don't know if there's any way for you to do a control find type of a scenario with the lecture if it's posted in this type of format. So everything's going to be an MP4, won't be posting any of the PowerPoint slides. So we'll get started with the material for today. And the material for today starts with a discussion about what is geography. So I know that some of you probably may not have taken a geography course at all before. Or maybe if you have taken a geography course, you haven't, no one has explained to you what geography is. So for those of you who are thinking that they just took this as a business class, or because it's required for your concentration in the business school, for example, it's important that you know what geography is, what it means. And really, geography can be broken down into two words, so geo and graphen. And graphen, these are Greek words. Graphen is to write about the earth, or to write rather, and geo is the earth. So this is a study about writing about the earth. And a lot of the early geography literature dealt with describing a particular region or a particular area. They would have books that would do a study on the geography of the Orient or the geography of Germany. But today, the geography literature is much less about description of particular regions, and instead, I'm going to go down to that last bit of this last sentence. Geographers instead, today, they study why space or something's location on the earth matters. So it's a little bit less about describing a particular region of the world, and it's a little bit more about understanding the role of space or location. So in the same way that historians study why time matters, why particular events occurred after the French Revolution, or what were the events leading up to the U.S. Civil War, for example, geographers deal with why place or location matters instead of time. We do also focus on this element of time too, so we're greedy and we take a lot of things under our arm. Geography is a rather nebulous idea, but basically we're going to be studying about why space and location matters. And in this particular class, we'll be looking at why space and location matters for economic processes, why the economy, how the economy manifests itself in space. So what is the role of something's location on the Earth, and how it is put into an economic system, how it relates to an economic system. So within geography, there are two major branches of geography. There is a human geography and a physical geography. So a physical geography, this is a branch of geography that deals with earth science, deals with formation of rocks. I guess that's a little bit more of geology, but geographers do that as well. They do hydrology, how a stream's location on the Earth is dependent on its physical attributes of that place. So the presence of trees or rocks or elevation, things along those lines. So the human geography, though, is what we are going to be a little bit more interested in this class. And human geography deals with the geography of human processes. So how does, for example, a language, so there have been lots of geography studies about the spread of language, the diffusion of language over space. So how has the evolution of a language followed the people that have lived or migrated from place to place on the Earth? This is an example of human geography. And economic geography is a subset of human geography. So when we're talking about economic geography, we're talking about how the economic processes of humans, as opposed to the physical geography dealing with nature, the processes of the earth. We're looking at instead people. So what are the economic processes that manifest themselves in society, and where are they located in space, and how does space, or things' location on the earth, how does that affect that economic process? So some of the major questions we're going to be looking at in economic geography are, why does space matter in international economics? These are major questions for the course we're going to be looking at. How is the international economic activity? So even within a city, there are some economic activities that are very governed by something's role in space, where it's located. How do they connect to the international economy? So how does the dynamics of one city or several cities, how do they impact more global scales, from city to city, from place to place, and country to country? And last, what are the lingering roles and the falling roles of national boundaries in international economics? So when you conduct a business transaction that crosses national boundaries, you have a whole host of additional issues to consider than you do under an economic transaction that takes place purely within the national boundaries of one country. So, for example, there are linguistic differences from country to country. There are differences in legal systems and the enforcement of different legal promises. So if you sign a contract with someone that's located in another country, you need to make sure that there is going to be some type of commonly agreed on regime to govern that contract. So countries have to have a set of certain agreements about how they're going to enforce contracts between people of different countries. And that's not really as much of an issue within one country itself. So within the United States, for example, most states have enacted the Uniform Commercial Code or something along those lines that follows that code very, very closely. So within the United States, contracts, there's not a whole lot of, yeah, sure, there are nuances from place to place, but for the most part, they're very standardized. And you can see enforcement of these contracts across state boundaries. But at the international context, you have a whole other set of legal issues to deal with. So national boundaries, they affect international economics, they affect international business transactions for a whole host of other reasons that you can imagine, but it's going to be one of the other major focuses of this course, looking at how national boundaries affect international economics. Currency is another one that we're going to be dealing with heavily. So the currency of one country and the currency of another country are different. How do changing values of those currencies affect international trade? There's a lot to go. So we've been talking about geography and economic geography. And we basically touched a little bit on what is economics. We talked about economic transactions, business transactions. Well, the traditional definition of economics, really, you can see it in that article. Does it matter whether whether or not economics is a science? Or I think it's just, doesn't matter whether economics is a science. The traditional definition is the study of helping people choose how best to distribute scarce resources. So economics sees the world's resources in a scarce light. So money is scarce. Trees are scarce. Everything is really scarce. So there's a finite limit to how much you have. Even when it comes to human capital, you still have a finite amount of people who are able to provide new ideas or for management roles, or who are qualified to conduct research and development. These are all scarce resources. So pretty much every resource in economics is scarce, and this deals with the way that people choose to distribute those resources. And one of the major central features of economics, just about every economic model that's used to describe the way the economy works, deals with this thing called the market. So this is a concept that should be familiar to those of you, even if you haven't taken a prior economics class. The market is something that is it's a mechanism that buyers and sellers use to coordinate transactions in these scarce resources, to choose how some of these scarce resources are distributed to different people. So note that this market, the market economy, is not always the socially optimal distribution of these resources. So just because the market seems to like that idea, the idea of something, we don't always see it as the socially optimal thing. So one example of this, one of the examples we'll look at from a geographic perspective, is the formation of monopolies. So a monopoly is a condition where one firm or one business, one person, is the sole provider of a good or service to a particular community. And when there is a monopoly position that is emerged, this could be due purely to market forces. When a monopoly condition has emerged, that firm or that business is able to set prices for all the consumers. So why is this a bad thing? Well, without any competition, that scarce resource provider can be free to charge very high rates for that particular good or service. And particularly in cases where the good or service is very important for people's livelihood, for example, water, electricity, phone or internet access, things along those lines. It can be, in some cases, considered not socially optimal to allow one particular provider of these goods and services to have a monopoly. And this is the reason why governments across the world have antitrust and competition laws, things along those lines. So, but the market is something that we want to look at right now to kind of help you start to understand what economic geography is about. I want to take this very central feature of economic geography and or just economics in general and show you how the market has many, many geographic dimensions as well. So many of you are probably familiar with the idea of a market, but I want to show you how the market also has a geography. It's not just this abstract economic idea. In fact, the market manifests itself in a very spatial way, in several spatial ways. So when people think of the market, this is often the kind of market that they think of. Going to the market today. Here, there's a fish market. And I think this is a clip that I have from Singapore. It wasn't my picture, but this is an example of a market. And we have here, there's a buyer. There's at least one buyer, many buyers here, and we have a seller. In this case, it looks like these are buying and selling fish or vegetables or something like that. So these are the buyers over here. We have some sellers, and we have a transaction that's occurring between these two groups. People that are over here are demanding these goods, either fish or vegetables, whatever, and we have a seller. So here is a way that in economics we see that there is a channeling of scarce resources, these fish or these vegetables, from the seller to the buyer. And the way that's determined who gets what here is not only if these people have the money that it costs to buy the fish or buy these vegetables, but they also, their presence here. So when did they show up? Did they get here on time? Were they the first ones in line? So this was an example of a market. So in this very particular example of the market, what is the geography of this market? Well, so in other words, how does space matter for this very specific type of market that we just looked at there, that fish market or that vegetable market? Well, buyers and sellers, they're all going to this one particular physical place to exchange their goods for money in this case. So all the people, the villagers from around the area, even though they might be living very far away from the market, we'll say, is in this triangle area right here, everyone is going to be collectively going together to this one place, this one centralized place to buy their produce. And this physical proximity facilitates that commerce, facilitates those transactions. So by being very close to one another, those buyers can examine the quality of the fish that they're buying. They're not buying their fish or their vegetables online. They're very close to the seller of those goods. They want to be right there. They want to be close to them. And this helps them alleviate some transaction costs involved with this transaction. So the buyers are going to know that the quality of the fish is a particular way. They're not going to see it's not spoiled. The vegetables are in good order, and they're at a good price. So buyers can go from stall to stall and compare prices. So geography, in this case space, helps the buyers and sellers. The physical proximity or low space between buyers and sellers in this particular example is going to facilitate these transactions. So they're trying to just get you to understand that in this this one overarching concept in economics, the market, it has a physical location, and that physical location is important for how that market functions. And within the same marketplace, if we just expand our gaze just a little bit outwards from the fish market, well, we're not just talking about the fish market in this market. The fish market might be one of only very many different sellers all over the market. But people are still going to be coming from all over the place to buy goods and services in this one single place, this market. So trying to determine what is going to be in the market and what's out of the market is often simply a matter of perspective. So we start to see here that even in this very small example of something called a market, a place where buyers and sellers go to exchange goods and services for money or for other goods and services, well, it's a very complex thing. The market is a very complex phenomenon. It's very difficult to try to understand what is the market by looking at all the component parts of the market. It's actually going to require us to use a level of abstraction to understand what is going on at the market. And we need to focus on certain particular aspects of the market. We can't just look at every single type of transaction, every stall, every buyer and seller in this marketplace. It's just far too complex to understand at once. So we're going to see how abstraction is necessary in our economic models and how it can also lead to some negative consequences when we go and look to apply those economic models in a political way or in a real sense. So another example I wanted to just share with you about the geography of something called a market. Well, when you're buying or selling a business, if you're selling a business, the buyer often is going to be requiring you to sign what's called a non-compete clause. So what is a non-compete clause? Let's say that you are producing bagels. You're a seller of bagels. And you're well known, you have a very strong name recognition in your neighborhood for selling bagels. And a larger company comes and offers to buy your bagel business from you. We'll say that's, I don't know, Starbucks. You got a lot of money. So Starbucks is looking to buy your bagel business. And they're offering you a lot of money to get out of this bagel business. So let's say that you accept their offer and the contract to sell doesn't include a non-compete clause. Well, they buy up your bagel factory. They have all your stores and everything like that. Stores. Let's say that you turn around and instead of being named XY Corp, you call yourself ZZ Corp, and you start producing bagels you start producing new bagels with a new factory and new stores using that money that Starbucks gave you, and you start selling back into that same neighborhood. Well, what has Starbucks lost out on here? They lost out on the reasonable expectation that by buying your business, they were also buying your customers, not only your stores, but also they were going to be buying a particular market area. So if they don't have these non-compete clauses in there, well, you're just going to be creating a new competitor by giving them money and letting them start up again. So there are other, whenever a lawyer sells part of his share in a partnership, for example, there's always a stipulation that these type of clauses need to be observed, or at least they're implied in the sale of that part of a share. But in regular contracts, you need to make sure that you're stipulating this. And what is the geography of these non-compete clauses? Well, you need to make sure that these non-compete clauses are not overly harsh. So maybe the Starbucks is not going to be requiring you to never produce any bagels or baked goods in the entire country, but at least within your neighborhood. Or if we're talking about, instead of your sale of bagels, we're talking about your labor or your management skills. Sometimes a company will require that someone, before they hire them, sign a non-compete clause. So if they ever become unemployed by the company, they won't turn around and start working for one of their competitors. But we can't prohibit someone from selling bagels or from selling their labor in just everywhere. They would need to make a living still. But often they have a interpreted geographic scope of these type of clauses where they only apply in a certain geography or over a certain space. So again, all these examples of the geography of this market is just to help you start to understand that the economy has a lot of spatial dimensions to it. So this is what economic geographers look at. We look at how these processes occur in space. So what is the impact of non-compete clause on someone's ability to provide for themselves later in life? In one of the other examples we'll get to a little bit later in the course from an article, when you have in that monopoly circumstance, when you have a bank that's buying up new banks in an area, there's very strict anti-competition law that comes into play. So we want to make sure that banks don't people that are in an area don't have to go all to one bank to deposit their money. It's going to provide them with unfair terms and can potentially have very low rates for depositors, very high rates for creditors, or for people who are seeking a loan in those places. So again, the geography of a market, the place, the physical manifestation of place is very important when we're considering the economy. You need to know that economic processes occur at different spatial scales. So how can we conceptualize all the different dimensions of the market from a geographic perspective? Well, the short answer is, and comes apparent when you look at that article, doesn't matter whether economics is a science, is that in order to understand the economy, and in particular in order to understand all those complexities of the geography of that economy or the market, you have to use abstraction. You can't just look and study that market. You have to break it down and say, okay, there are stalls located here, the buyers are located here, things along those lines. So we're going to start looking at a way of connecting and looking at things in this perspective, in this light. But it's not possible to consider every single transaction that happens in that vegetable or that fish market. You can't look for it where all the buyers are coming from, where all the sellers are coming from, and everything just gets too complex. So you need to take a step backwards and look at this from a little bit of a higher perspective. So I always like to use this example in my classes when I first start off about what economic models are, what are some of the dangers of using them. And this is a painting by a French artist. I actually forgot the year. Should go back and look at it, but it's a fairly old painting by a French painter named René Magritte. So looking at this painting, just like to have you take a second here, maybe even pause after I am done with my sentence and my question here. Take a moment and think about this. So for those of you who don't speak French, at the bottom here of the pipe painting there is this phrase that says "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." And what this means in English is that it says this is not a pipe. Now, the question that I have for you, and that you can pause and take a second to think about this, why would this author, or this painter rather, why would they say this is not a pipe and then paint a pipe here? What is going on here? Is this just something that's just some absurdist type of art that makes no sense and that you're just supposed to think about it from some weird level, or what? So take a second, pause the tape, think about it for a second, and we'll get to the answer. Hopefully we're not too excited and jump right away. Okay, so hopefully you've had a couple seconds to think about that. And what Marguerite said regarding this painting is the following. Oh, that famous pipe. How people reproached me for it. And yet, could you stuff my pipe? No, it's just a representation, is it not? So if I had written on my picture, this is a pipe, I'd have been lying. So Marguerite says that this is not a pipe. And in fact, it's certainly not a pipe. You can't stuff it with tobacco. You can't smoke it. You can't feel it, pick it up in your hands. You can't look at the grains of wood on it. In fact, what this is a painting of a pipe. In fact, this is actually not a painting of a pipe. This is a well, it's now we're at another level of abstraction here, but this is now we're at a little bit of even more abstraction. We're moving from JPEG to an MP4 format. That's the video format. And originally, this was a painting of a pipe. And at every level here of abstraction, from pipe, literal, actual pipe that this author had seen before painting this picture, when you move from a pipe to just a painting of a pipe, well, you have one of your first level of abstraction. So you have that first level of abstraction. You're moving from the pipe to the painting of the pipe. So with that level of abstraction, what are you gaining? Well, as Marguerite said, he gained the ability to simply paint something into existence. And it could be flat, nearly two-dimensional, shipped around. People could, copy it and send it all over the place. It's a lot easier to send and ship than a pipe. So you're gaining something by that. You're gaining simplicity and your understanding of what this thing is and your ability to transfer it from person to person. But what are you losing out on from a pipe to a painting? Well, you're missing out on the smell of the pipe. You're missing out on the texture of the pipe. You're missing out on your ability to actually smoke the pipe. You're missing out on a whole bunch of things here. So when you are, so each of these is levels of abstraction is going to be requiring you to have some assumptions about, at least as far as what we have in economic models, when we go from one level of abstraction to the next. You have to have some assumptions when you're thinking about this pipe. Now you're like, well, I think it probably will have a woody smell to it, but I can't be sure because it's too much detail to actually look and see this pipe in general. So between the painting and the computer image of the painting, you're also going and you're getting another level of abstraction. Now you're at the second level of abstraction. What are you missing between the painting of the pipe and the computer image of the pipe? Well, maybe the way that the artist painted what's on that pipe, what's on the canvas. Maybe there's a particular way that he applied the paint on this so that you can't see there's any ridges raised or the smoothness of the paintbrush, for example. So again, at every level of abstraction, you're going to be missing out on some of the detail about what is actually in the real world item. And when you lose out on that, you have to be making some assumptions when you're thinking about this as a pipe. So what does it smell like? How did the person then paint it onto the picture? How did they capture all these? These are all things that are lost from one level of abstraction to the next. And the same type of concept is going to apply when we're looking at economic models. Particularly when we start talking about our economic models of trade next week, you're going to be wanting to understand that because the economy is such a complex thing, moving from step to step in the understanding of an economy, so abstracting first to an economic model, even if it's a very complex one, you necessarily are going to have tons of assumptions in that model about how the world actually works. And those assumptions are going to be informing how your model holds up, and they're going to be influencing a whole bunch of other things. And sometimes you find that the assumptions that you build into these economic models are really their gravestones. So they make things so that the economic model really doesn't work at all. So I'll show you some examples next week, and hopefully show you both the value, the utility of economic models, and also how they can be problematic when you have these assumptions built into them. Okay, so again, what are you missing with that pipe? For each step, you're missing something. So for each level of abstraction, you have to have some omissions. And these omissions, in the context of economic models, when we're abstracting the economy from reality, you're going to be having to have some assumptions. And sometimes these assumptions can be the death knell for the economic model itself, and they always need to be examined. This is one of the major themes of that. It doesn't matter whether economics is a science article, is that you have to make sure that you're always accounting for the assumptions that are built into a particular economic model. So it turns out that we do this abstraction all the time in everyday life. We're always abstracting things. And one of the clearest examples for me is when you have an automobile engine. So especially for me, who is not a mechanic, usually when I have a problem with the car, I just take it right in and have someone else deal with the problems that are there. An engine is a very complex thing for me, and I imagine for many of you it is as well. So what do we do when we're thinking about the engine itself? How do we conceptualize an engine? Well, we're not usually thinking about, when we think about the engine, or if it's me thinking about the engine, we're not thinking about all these different components that go into the engine. We're not thinking about spark plugs and exhaust manifolds and flywheels. We just think about this as the engine. So if there's an issue with it, we usually just say the engine is broken. I'm not so savvy as to know that the filter hole is clogged or something along those lines. So we usually tend to black box these things. In other words, we take this idea of an engine and we abstract it into something that's very block-like. So instead of the engine being something like that, it's more this is just an example, but it's a little bit more square. There's this box around it. We call this black boxing, where you're not really understanding what is all the components of all this engine. Instead, you think about the engine as this big box. And people tend to do this with the economy as well. So you look at things like employment or labor markets. And these are usually things that are black boxed. So we'll just look at the US labor market and we'll put a big box over it and not think about all the different parts and the nuances and the geographic locations of different labor markets and different people in different places. But geography, we're going to be trying to open this box up a little bit and be examining some of these spatial components, where the particular parts are located in the engine. We're going to be looking at that with the economy and why space has to do with that. So we're going to be opening up this black box like the engine and looking at the economy from an insider's way. We're going to be trying not to think about the economy from such a complex perspective. We're going to be looking at it from a little bit more complex of a perspective. So when something goes wrong, usually when something has been black boxed or has been abstracted like this, you really notice the particular components when something goes wrong. So the same thing happens when you look at your economic models and your assumptions in them. When you look at your assumptions of economic models, you need to, when there's a problem with the way the model works, then you have to open up that box, that black box, and try to understand what are all the things that are inside of it. And so this air filter maybe is the thing that's an issue with the engine at this point. So when you look and your economic model is having problems, you need to look at the assumptions that underlie that economic model and then try to pull them out. And we're going to be doing that in this class from a geographic perspective. Oops, spelled that wrong. You get the idea. Geographic perspective. Okay. So one more point about assumptions. This is a a little bit of a joke, which is not terribly funny, but I always like to share it anyways. So the joke goes, there is a physicist, an engineer, and an economist that have all washed ashore in a desert island, and they don't have anything to eat. And suddenly a can of soup washes ashore. So the physicist comes up with he's writing all these formulae, trying to tell you, how if he drops the can out of a tree at a certain height on a certain rock, the force should pop the top open at a certain trajectory, and they should be able to eat the soup. The engineer is busy trying to rig up a little bit of a machine to actually unscrew the lid of the can so they can all eat together. And the economist says, hey guys, why don't we just assume that there's a can opener to open this can? So this is the joke about economists, that so much of their discipline is ruled by assuming that there is something that is in the model when they don't really know for a fact whether it's there or not. And the reason for this is that economists have to deal with abstractions all the time. For the reasons that we talk about in the article, does it matter whether or not economics is a science? Well, a physicist can recreate a particular experiment anytime it wants, or anytime he wants or she wants. She could drop a can out of a tree and repeat that experiment for 300 times if she wanted to. And, those particular physical objects all behave very nicely for her, and they always do the same things all the time. And there's not a lot of probability to take into consideration. And the same thing for the engineer. But for the economist, you can't, carry on an experiment with an economy, a blind experiment with an economy, and then have a control variable going at the same time. Most of the time, economic observations have to do with seeing things in retrospect. So looking at the economy in the past and saying, okay, what are some of the assumptions we're going to have if we think that this model will apply in the future? So again, we need to be careful about these assumptions that are built into economic models. And starting next class, we start to look at models of trade, why countries carry out international trade with one another. You're going to be looking at these assumptions and how sometimes they're really so devastating to an economic model that they can be, the economic model itself completely falls into question. So we mentioned already that the economy, or even a marketplace, is what's called a complex system. So it often arrives at results that aren't reasonably or easily foreseen by all the parts that make it up. And some of the major reasons, again, we have that lack of experimentation that I talked about, not being able to repeat your experiments in a lab. Secondly, we have human behavior is notoriously difficult to predict. Unlike two chemicals where if you mix them under the right conditions and the right circumstance, they'll do a particular thing all the time. Humans have a very strange way of not always following what you think that they're going to be doing. And so in order to understand such a complexity of these models, not only do they have so many parts, but all those parts are humans that are in there, and they all have their own minds about what they want to do and how they want to behave, and you can't repeat your experiments in a controlled environment. Well, in order to study the economy, then you have to have abstractions. You have to have economic models, and by extracting, you're going to be failing to recognize the complete inflexity that goes into them. So you have to have some assumptions. So one example of how we can start to look at the economy from an abstract perspective, I just wanted to show you this example of the use of networks. And in the very last days of class, we're going to be looking at a very particular network-based abstraction approach to understanding the economy. And we'll also be dealing with networks a little bit when we talk about currency, but this is a particular approach for looking at the international economy from a geographic perspective.
And what I want to just bring out at the beginning, like the market, things that people are usually, pretty familiar with, so people understand networks, the social network. If you've seen, we're going to be looking at an example from Facebook. How do networks help people understand what the role of space is in the international economy? So networks, I'm going to go relatively quickly over this slide, but networks can be loosely defined as a set of three different parts. So first there are nodes, or these circles here. And nodes are going to be representative of people, institutions, cities maybe within them, firms. These are all actors, we'll call them, or people that do things, or things that do things. And these, what are called edges, or these lines between them, these represent the relationships between the nodes, or between the actors. So in this case, this might be a set of board members and their communication with one another, members of an organization's board, of a corporation's board of directors. Or they might be individuals that are carrying out transactions with one another, so they're selling things or buying things from one another. And so this is an example of a network. So we have nodes, are the people or the actors doing something. The edges are the relationships between them. And finally, from a geographic perspective, all of these networks also have a location, or a spatial location. And often where the nodes and the edges are located, their spatial location, their location on the Earth, their geography, makes a big difference. So let's just say, for example, that this group of nodes and edges is all within the US, and these group of nodes and edges are all within, let's say, Iran. And for those of you keeping up with even relatively current events, you'll know that the US has had a system of sanctions on Iran for some time. So they prohibit. The U.S. has been prohibiting its businesses from doing business with Iran for some time, and in recent years it's been very restrictive, even prohibiting companies from other countries from doing business with Iran that want to also do business in the United States. So if we look at this network from a geography perspective, that all these actors are bound together, and these actors are bound together, well, you might see that there is this connecting node here, and we might be wondering who that is, who's dealing with Iran, or we might be looking at, what are the interconnections of the nodes within this small subnetwork versus the connections between the nodes of this subnetwork. What are the relationships with, let's say this is India, what are the relationships here? So everything's spatial location is going to have a difference. And this is just an example with different countries, but look at examples of networks within cities, between cities, even between individuals as well, and how geography makes a big deal for these types of transactions. So network approach, we have these, basically the important parts of this slide are we have these three components of networks, and they're going to help us understand the economy from a spatial perspective. So let's first look at what the locations of the people, the nodes here, have to say about them. Well, notice that the connections that people have within countries seem to be, in many cases, much stronger than the connections that people have outside of countries. So you're more likely to be friends with someone that lives in your country that lives in another country. And for a lot of countries, there are many more transactions or connections with people that occur within them than occur outside of them. And this also often applies to market transactions. So a lot of the economies of even some of the most export-oriented type countries are often very much stronger within the country than outside the country. We can also look at the distance between countries and their connections with other places. So the longer the distance between two countries, for the most part, there are fewer connections. There are some areas with no connections. In some cases, this could be due to demographic reasons. So people in those places don't have access to the internet. They don't have people in those countries don't tend to have enough money to buy a computer, and if they did, they wouldn't be using it for Facebook, maybe. There's also some political reasons. So, for example, you'll notice in that graphic that that Chinese area, the area of China, is oddly quiet. So now Facebook recently opened up a sales office in China, but as of yet, China is still not allowed Facebook to operate there. Maybe less likely to do so now after the whole NSA, the NSA scandal kind of is blown up. But right, so there's other social media networks that already operate in China, so they don't have. So that's why a reason there. So this is again geography. Why is geography mattering in this map, and would we have seen that without looking at this network type of approach? So there's so much complexity that goes into this that we can draw out with the use of this network perspective. So a few other ones, language and cultural connections. I think you'll notice that, for example, Brazil and Portugal have a relatively strong interconnection with one another, and the reason for there is obviously there's this not only a common history in this colonizer colony perspective, but also they speak Portuguese there as well. So there's a little bit of an easier facilitation of personal transactions in that case. But also with France and a number of African colonies, former African colonies, you can see Spanish the same way. England and the United States, same thing. So there are many other trends, and if you'd like to take a few moments to check out the map and take a look at them and check them out, see if you can see any other trends that are here. So, and see if you want to take a look at a number of the trends that I had already mentioned. So I asked you in the reading assignment to watch that little documentary clip on emergence with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Hopefully you guys enjoyed seeing him. I always do. And when you watch that, you think through it was discussing emergence. And if you haven't, for some reason, had a chance to watch it and you haven't completed the reading assignment, you ought to go ahead and watch the documentary here. This is the YouTube link. I posted the link. The other link I posted is directly on the NOVA's website itself, so you can access this one if you prefer. So while watching the video, after watching the video discussed emergence. So what is emergence? And emergence basically is defined by an unexpected pattern resulting in not from a top-down hierarchical command, but instead from the simple behavior and interactions of these individual agents at the bottom of that emergent phenomenon. So unlike, let's say, this type of a hierarchy or this type of a network where we have some kind of centralized decision maker here giving commands to, let's say, all of his or her employees in this business, instead of having something like that, maybe this is a board of directors and this is a CEO. Well, instead of that, there is also that we can contrast this type of a hierarchical network with something that's more, or we can consider all channel, and you tend to see emergence in these type of networks. So where there is a number of different actors, there is this unexpected pattern or complexity that arises, and it's not due to any type of centralized decision making or commanding authority. So emergent processes tend to be this all-channel type of a network where you don't have the hierarchical decision making coming from up top, instead coming from the bottom up. Okay, so I'd like to, now we're running about 1 hour, I'd like to take a pause and go to our first break, and then I'll be posting, and I'll continue right after this. Okay, so we're going to get started again here. You can always, of course, feel free to pause the recording at any time and come back. I just had lunch. So, all right. So we're getting to economics as a study of emergent processes. So we see that economics in many ways can be thought of as an emergent process where we don't have this single top-down decision-making organization or body telling everyone what to produce and what to exchange with one another, but instead in many ways, the economy exhibits characteristics of emergence. We'll also see that at the end of the lecture that really the economy is based on both these emergent processes and a more hierarchical direction where we have centralized decision making and we have authority being channeled down through a hierarchy. We do see that as well in the economy, but for right now, want to look at economics from this particular emergent perspective. So, just like to get back into what is emergence. So, I have this article that I had you read, and this deals with emergent complexity in slime molds. So, the article discusses that slime molds have sort of memory or a brain-like function. Even though they don't have a brain, there is a seemingly uncoordinated complex pattern, unexpected complex pattern that has arisen from the behavior of just a very simple behavior of a number of different agents. So this is the emergent. So a slime mold is an organism that has no brain. It's one cell technically, but there are millions of identical cell nuclei within that cell, and each of these nuclei help to actually guide the organism towards food and to solving complex spatial problems as far as growing towards and finding food. So what the slime mold does is each of the areas where there's a nuclei will be searching out and looking for food, and if it doesn't find any in that particular area, it leaves a slime trail so that as the organism is growing, as the organism gets to that point where their slime trail has been left, if it knows there's no food there, so it continues to grow around that area towards their area where there is food. So here we have a seemingly uncoordinated group of agents. In this case, these are the cell nuclei, and they are all it looks like they're actually working together towards a common goal, and that goal is to reach food that's going to be benefiting everyone. So the slime mold here, we have an unexpected order arising from the simple decisions of agents, which are the cell nuclei. So again, I just want to show you that this is an example of emergent complexity or emergence that was discussed in the video on the NOVA documentary with Neil deGrasse Tyson. So economics, finally we're talking about economics, now we're not talking about slime molds anymore. Well, again, economic models also tend to describe emergent behavior. So sometimes they're also going to be discussing the effect of government regulation, something along those lines, but a lot of economic models deal with emergent behavior. In this case, we're talking about the emergent behavior of humans and not slime molds. So this is a very simple economic model that many of you are probably already familiar with, and this is the supply and demand curve and the relationship between the supply of a good or service, the demand for that good or service, the price, that that good or service commands in the market and the quantity that is supplied or demanded from producers and consumers. So this is just a very simple economic model, and what it does is shows you the relationship between a number of different factors. So this supply and demand curve would say that if there is suddenly a decrease in supply, so I'll move the supply up here, and everything else is held constant, demand is held constant, that we see that there's going to be a new relationship here where if supply is restricted in a good, so suddenly there's been a bad harvest for corn this year and the supply of corn has fallen, that the quantity that producers are going to produce is going to be reduced due to this increasing scarcity, and the price that that corn is going to command on the market is actually going to be higher than it was before. We have a restriction in supply. Conversely, if we have an expansion in supply, we have an increase in the output, the quantity. We have a decrease in price. And similarly, if suddenly there's a rise in demand and everything else is staying the same, supply is staying the same, well, now we have the same supply, so there's going to be increasing scarcity for that. We're going to have a higher price and an increase in the quantity demanded by customers. So what is the point of this? I'm not going to be going through and making sure that you know how the supply and demand curve works on a final exam, but want to show you that there is this emergence of a market price, a single market price based on the actions of producers and consumers of goods. And these, in this model, this economic model, the producers and consumers are the agents of an emergent phenomenon, So the way that these all work together, we're not just talking about producers and consumers from, one at a time. We're talking about groups of them. So they are the agents in this model, and this type of emergent phenomenon, the allocation of goods based on market price and supply and demand, this all goes to that idea of there being an invisible hand in a market economy where decisions are made by the agents themselves and not by a hierarchical authority. And this invisible hand idea is that resources are naturally channeled to their most productive or most efficient uses in this fictional market economy where there is no government intervention of any kind. Market economy. So we see that in economics there is also emergent activity that takes place. So again, too, though, note that this type of a model is only an abstraction. So the economy is never so mechanical as to always follow this same pattern where there is a condition where supply is increased but demand always stays the same, and price never fully reflects changes in supply and demand due to a number of factors, geographical factors among them. So maybe the supply or demand of, we're talking about corn, maybe the supply of corn has decreased in the United States but has actually increased in Canada. And because there is increasingly strong trade in agricultural products between the U.S. and Canada, maybe there is no difference in price. So you have to remember that all of these economic models are simply abstractions. So it's important that we remember what is built into the assumptions that underline these abstractions. But nevertheless, you notice that, of course, with the example of supply and demand curve, these are very, they're considered to be useful models because they help describe what the relationship of different factors are in society. So how there can be an emergent single price for a good in a very competitive market. So again, in economics, we're talking about models. Models are necessarily abstractions of reality, and often these economic models describe emergent phenomenon in human society. So given that, I'd like to go to the just a discussion of the I-pencil essay. And I know you're not going to be able to directly answer me this question, but I am curious, and maybe I'd like to pose it in the next reading assignment just for you to give me some of your thoughts on this essay. So did you like it? What did you think about it? Were you convinced by his argument? Was it too sly of an argument for you? Things along those lines. So yeah, I always like to use this just as an example of, you know, trying to understand the emergent processes of the economy. So like one of the other questions too I have for you is, how in this article, how is the economy seen as the product of an emergent system? Just think about that for a second after you have read the article, or read the essay rather. And the answer I have here is that there is no central guiding authority that tells everyone how to make a pencil. In fact, there's no single, the author argues that there is no single person that does know how to make a pencil. In fact, there are many bits of know-how throughout the world that are involved in the mining of graphite, for example, that goes into a pencil, and the sawing of the wood planks, and the making of brass from those two raw materials that go into the making of brass, and everything along these lines, where there are there are producers located throughout the world, and their coordination is not from the top down. So the production of this product is not from the top down, where there's a centralized decision-making authority. Instead, the pencil emerges as a product of the economic system, where people have an incentive to make money. They're buying and selling goods in order to make a profit, in order to make money. And the consequence of this emergent process, without any kind of, now the author doesn't describe any centralized decision-making authority or hierarchical, non-emergent types of constraints, although we'll see that this is actually an incomplete view of the economy. His description of that emergent process of the creation of the pencil, I thought, was very strong, and it helped to, you know, get your mind about interested in what how economics can be viewed as a study of emergent processes, and helping you to understand what is emergence, and something that in the future we're going to be looking at from a number of perspectives, but particularly geographic perspective. So if we were to look at, again, we're taking that network approach right now. It's not the only framework that we're going to be using to look at and study the economy this year, but just wanted to give you a couple examples of how there can be emergent phenomenon at play within this very same essay. So looking at the network of the production of a pencil, you're going to see that some of the location of some of the producers and the people who come together to make this pencil, the agents or the actors, how their geographic location plays a role in the production of that pencil. So in this case, our nodes are going to be representing the producers or the firms. The edges are going to be representing some kind of business transaction between them, the buying or the selling of raw materials or the provision of financing. And we have a map here that's going to show where those nodes and edges are located in space.
So I have here a number of the different producers. So we have pumice, for example, coming from, I think it was Italy here. We have Sri Lanka as the site for the graphite mine. Indonesia has the canola oil that goes into the making of the rubber eraser. There are clay fields here in Mississippi. There's a pencil factories located, we'll say, near Chicago. And there's this logging company and a wood mill that are actually located relatively near one another. And we're just going to say, I think that actually was mentioned in the essay as well, but that the provision of financing for the machines that are in the pencil factory was financed by a firm in, we'll say, New York City. So some of the questions we have are, why are these producers located in these places? And geography has come up with a lot of explanations as to why certain economic activity tends to take place in certain areas, certain geographic places in the world. So one example, one question is you might have is, well, why is the mill and the logging company, the people who chop down the wood and the people who then plane it into boards and make the pencil, the wooden portions of the pencil, why might they be located close to one another? So one of the topics we're going to be discussing in the course is the effect of a product's weight on where that product is produced and sold. So in the case of lumber and timber, after the timber is harvested, so someone cuts down a tree, that product actually loses a lot of its weight in the next step of its production. So when you're moving from wood as it growing out of the ground in a tree form to, let's say, a piece of furniture or a board or a pencil, at each step in that production process, actually, that first initial step, you have the transformation of trees into boards. And that necessarily involves shaving off a lot of that additional weight of the tree, the bark of it, all the pieces of a tree that are dead or won't make for good boards if the grain is the wrong way. Those pieces will be removed and discarded. So often you see this in resource extraction industries where the product actually loses weight from one stage to the next. So it makes sense then, instead of shipping logs all around the world to be shaven down, you'd be better off, constructing a mill, a board factory near where the trees are being logged. That way you can reduce your eventual transportation costs from one to the next. One place to the next when you go to actually sell those boards. So you're not lugging around big logs all the time. You can just bring around the boards that are made from that wood. And we'll see there is just the opposite type of phenomenon happens in the soft drink industry. So Coke and Pepsi and things like that, they locate their bottling plants near the markets where they sell the goods because their product actually gains weight throughout the course of its production. So it starts as sugar and syrup, and then that is transported from place to place. So instead of carrying all this water weight around when you produce the syrup, when you're going to market, you can just bottle and add water near the market, and then you're going to be, again, minimizing your transportation costs. So here's another reason that geography creeps in to the provision of different types of economic activity. So different business arrangements, how they're governed by space. So again, the mill and the railroad company, why would they be located next to one another? Again, we're going to be minimizing that transportation cost. Why might the financial services firm be located in New York City? Well, it turns out that New York City, this goes back to a little bit more of the regional perspective in geography, where they would describe a particular region's economic activity. Well, New York City has had a very long history of providing financing for different types of projects. So a lot of banks have their home there because they want to be close to their potential customers and to take advantage of a labor pool of people there live there that are highly skilled and qualified and know what they're talking about as far as financial services are concerned. So we're going to be talking about this a little bit later on in the class as to why certain firms from certain industries tend to co-locate or locate near firms, other similar and complementary firms in that same industry. So I just have here a example of what the network for production of pencils might look like, and you see even at this time, the time that this article was or this essay was written, we're talking about, you know, the production of products really spans the globe. So it's sometimes not very helpful to look at the economy from just a national perspective, but you might want to look at it instead from an international perspective. So I'm just going to skip this slide and this one. So we're going to be examining all types of questions about the location of different types of economic activity, the extraction of raw materials, the issuance of currency, the place of and the locations and consequences of different institutions in the financial services industry, be they national governments or banks, investment banks, corporations. We're going to be looking at the consequences of where things are located for all kinds of different economic processes in this course, and it's really one of the major focuses of the course, besides helping you to understand the economy, so that when you pick up the newspaper you can really appreciate what's going on in it. But the other main goal is to help you start thinking about the economy from a spatial perspective. So how does space matter? And this is really what we're getting at with economic geography. I'm trying to drive home with giving you some examples of economic geography, how space matters for different economic processes. So getting back to economics as an emergent phenomenon, if you haven't already, and this was part of the reading assignment as well, but I'd like you to go and check out question 1 to the experts, John Holland, about emergence. And this is something that, you know, I've had students in the past ask this question before about, you know, the value of looking at emergent phenomenon, and they have the same type of issues as the author of the article, Does It Matter Whether or Not Economics is a Science, that they address in that article, and that is, you know, if you have this this idea of emergence, the way you define it is that really it falls short of a science because you can't retest the hypotheses. So it's very difficult to carry out a controlled blind experiments. So the author or this particular person posing this question says, you know, how does a study of emergent processes, how does it advance knowledge, since you can't go back and retest the theories? And another question, the answer to that question rather, is if John Holland uses the example of chess or checkers. So just by knowing the two players that are playing chess or checkers, you don't know where they're going to be moving their pieces. And where they're going to be, they don't even know where they're going to be moving their pieces until their turn comes. And they're looking at all the different combinations that they have. And they're looking at what the other player's done, so they're responding. We're talking about adaptive systems here. Despite the fact that you can never be sure with such precision as to where a person is going to be moving his or her chess pieces, that there are certain patterns that you can follow that will help to influence or maybe maximize your chance of winning the game. So there are some better options and some worse options all the time. So someone may decide to act irrationally in one case and not pursue the best course for winning this game of checkers or chess, but you know that there is certain probabilities of winning that are associated with different plays and different moves. So instead of looking at the world from a perspective of having to know exactly where the person is going to be moving his chess piece, you can say, well, if I move my chess piece here, what is the probability that that this will be a move to favor victory versus a move that will not favor victory? They also use an example of a vortex in a stream. So people who study hydrology, they may not know precisely where the vortex is going to form and for how long it will stay, or they might not be able to predict that there will be a vortex that forms. But by understanding the conditions that lead to the formation of those vortices, they can understand a lot more about the process that happens underneath the vortex, so they can maybe help to stop one if the goal is to prevent there from being a vortex in that place. So and so I'd like for you to also go ahead and check out on NOVA's website. There are some other everyday examples of emergence. I just want to really try to drive home, what is emergence? We're talking about a complex or a very specific pattern that's unexpected, given the simple actions of the agents that are participating in the system, and that this is not a hierarchical top-down direction. There's no composer, there's no general of the army telling everyone what to do. Instead, we have a bottom-up organization. And we saw an example from economics. We looked at supply and demand. Next class, we're going to be looking at this in the context of international trade. So, do firms, do countries have a natural incentive to trade with one another that is controlled more by a bottom-up type of behavior than a top-down type of behavior? And if we consider that it is from this bottom-up type of perspective, what are the consequences of that assumption in the economic model? And in particular, we're going to be looking at this in the case of comparative advantage, but we'll be looking at a few different models. So if you go ahead and go ahead to this NOVA's website, you can check out some other everyday examples of emergence to help you get an idea of what emergence is. And I just have a couple of those examples to show. So one of them that the book discusses a lot is a flock of birds. So we have each of these individual birds, and they're all flying together in this somewhat coordinated, seemingly complex pattern of birds, but there is no leader among them. This bird is not telling all the other ones which way to move and duck, but instead each bird is just recognizing what its neighbors are doing and following a set of very simple rules, and this creates this very complex type of behavior. So same thing with slime molds. They actually made it into the everyday examples. So I pulled that article prior to seeing this, but it's good to see the slime mold making another appearance. So now we're talking a little bit more about economics, and we're going to be looking at the self-organization of cities. So so it says here, neighborhoods of like-minded people and similar kinds of businesses establish themselves from the bottom up. So we're going to be looking at some of the emergent processes that happen in cities, why different industries locate themselves in different places within the city. And with the discussion of cities, we're also going to be looking at what is the effect of a city's interactions with other cities. And with the creation of nation states or countries, which happened long after the first cities, very long after the first cities, what did that do to the relationship of cities with one another? And the short answer there is that it helped to nationalize the system of cities so that there was less connection with cities of other countries. And this is a relatively new phenomenon, but something we'll be looking at a little bit later on in the course, again from this emergent versus hierarchical perspective. Again, we talked about the stock market and that invisible hand guiding prices through supply and demand of goods. And again, this is an example of emergence, the emergence of a single market price, for example. So there are other examples here. Some of the cool ones are, like a hurricane, and some people believe maybe consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. So an ant colony. So there's some other interesting everyday examples that you can check out. And we discussed chess as well as an emergent game of emergent complexity. So I'd like to get back to the discussion of economics as the study of emergent processes. So unlike in chemistry or some of the other hard sciences, this is one of the questions from your reading assignment. Experiments in economics, you can't reproduce your results very easily. So you can't say like to carry on a controlled study of labor markets over a 20-year period starting now. You can't just get a country and do what you like with it. So you have to always go by, most of the time, almost always, you have to go by what's been done in the past and what are these set of variables that we think are important. What did we observe them to be at that particular point? And what was the consequence there? So what happened? And then we try to understand this relationship based on causality. And sometimes it's tough. You have a chicken and an egg type of a problem where you're not sure, which one is a cause of the other. So we may discuss some of that too. But this is a problem in economics and economic geography especially. So often the best you can do is look for correlation between things that happened and their outcomes in the past. So economics as an emergent phenomenon, thinking about it as an emergent phenomenon, well, you can't predict where a vortex is going to be forming a stream exactly. You can't predict exactly where a player is going to be moving next, but you know that there are certain probabilities associated with certain other factors, and you know the way that certain variables are connected with one another, and that is really what economics is all about. And economic geography, more specifically, we're just going to be looking at these interconnections and how, if we take an abstraction, we abstract from reality, they can help us understand the connections in these type of emergent processes and how the agents might react to a non-emergent process, for example, a government regulation or the decision of a corporate officer on employees. So again, I wanted to just stress that the international economy it operates both as a type of hierarchical and a all-channel and emergent. It has emergent properties, and it also has this hierarchical and controlled. It has this hierarchical and a controlled side as well. So just as an example, some of the examples. Well, some decisions that are made in the economy come from a hierarchy. So you have, for example, the CEO of a corporation. Above them we have a board of directors. And there are often directives that come from the board of directors to the CEO, and then from the CEO onto the employees. But these aren't examples of emergent processes. Instead, we have here an example of a hierarchical decision that's been made, or the channeling of resources through a hierarchical means. Another example is U.S. government regulations, where the government will get together and decide that we want to organize economic activity in a particular way. So they will influence the economy from a hierarchical, a top-down perspective. But on the other hand, we also have this all-channel or emergent set of emergent properties in the economy. We already looked at supply and supply and demand curve there. So the market price for cotton over time. We're going to look at when we get to international agreements in the WTO. We're going to be looking at some of the ways that people think that these agreements sort of emerge naturally from the benefits accruing to being members of these international agreements for democratically elected governments throughout the world. So international agreements may also be an example of an emergent or all-channel type of phenomenon. So we'll be looking at tons of others, but for right now, it's really important that you remember that there is this dichotomy between this hierarchical process and, on the other hand, this emergent process. Hierarchical versus emergent, and that's a key thing to remember from here. We're going to be getting into some more examples of, what types of emergent activities we're interested in the economy, and how they manifest themselves in space. But right now, it's really important that you remember that, and be able to differentiate between a hierarchical type of process and emergent type of process, and that you recognize that in the international economy, there's really a confluence of both of these types of processes, where we have hierarchical decisions that are passed down, like government regulations on producers in a country, and we also have these emergent processes as well. Okay, so as a wrap up, I'd just like to give you guys a preview of the next unit we're going to be looking at. So again, I'll be posting the readings for this new unit by Monday, hopefully by noon. I'm going to try to start getting these things out earlier for you guys. And remember that the reading assignment that is going to be posted with that reading is due Wednesday before noon. And we're going to be really discussing, moving from emergence, we know what it is now, and we're going to be looking at models of trade. So in other words, why do countries trade with one another? What are some economic explanations for why we have trade between countries? And it turns out that some of these have actually been rather influential for helping to rationalize free trade agreements between countries today. That we're looking that trade is not a zero-sum game, where many years it was perceived to be a zero-sum game in the sense that when there was international trade, one country was necessarily going to benefit while another was going to lose out. But we'll see from one of the famous models of trade in particular that from an emergent perspective, and given a set of assumptions, as always, this particular model shows that international trade can actually be beneficial, and that it may in fact emerge naturally as an emergent phenomenon versus a hierarchical phenomenon. And so we're going to be looking at a number of different trade models, and we're going to also be looking at, in particular, some of their assumptions and what are the weaknesses of these assumptions. And when these models are used to justify political action, for example, the signing of a free trade agreement, what are the consequences to these assumptions? So, would the agreement have turned out differently had someone had people thought about all the assumptions that went into that model? So, this is just a little bit of a preview for the next unit. If anyone has any questions on anything, of course, feel free to email me. I will be posting prior to next quiz, so probably next Friday. What I'll do is I'll post a list of critical topics to remember and or to study for the quiz that we have, and I'll do the same for the midterm and the final. And you want to go through and make sure that you know all these topics, in particular, very well. So when I create the quizzes for the different quiz groups, I'll be basing it off of this sheet. So you can expect that in the future. But I hope you enjoyed the first lecture, and
we're going to be getting into, so the first few, first few units of this course are a little bit more nebulous, and we're going to be discussing a little bit more abstract concepts. But after the third or fourth unit, when we start talking about the WTO and other international organizations, we're going to start getting into a little bit more concrete descriptions of those institutions and how they function, and how some of the rulings have helped shape those institutions into the way they are today. So again, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to shoot me an email, and expect that reading on Monday, and that the reading assignment that's posted on Monday will be due on Wednesday. So make sure you're keeping up with your reading and your assignments, and I will be talking to you again in not too long. So have a great weekend.